that will help support you. And then you can refer to those references. The links are dropped in the box. And if you want to go ahead and look at them right now, you could do that as well. So 2.0, brand new teacher evaluation system. There are several major shifts when we move from 1.0 to 2.0. It is not just, oh, they ran out of names with 1.0, so they're going to call it 2.0. It is definitely a different model. OTES 1.0, if you look at the first column, is a performance model. It is about checking performance, performance of students, performance of teachers. However, if you look at the second column, OTES 2.0 is a growth model. Now, why switch to a growth model? Is that just because that's the nice thing to do? Actually, no. It is because research supports that a growth mindset for students, educators, and districts actually does a better job of identifying strengths and supports for professional learning needs, and that subsequently improves instruction. So some people like to call it, they're finally putting the cart after the horse, whereas the cart was testing scores, and not to call teachers horses, but that's kind of where you fall in the analogy. The second row, OTES 1.0 had that percentage, that standalone growth factor or growth measure, SGM. 2.0 has no student growth measures, no percentages. And as a colleague of mine likes to say, the math is gone. It is no longer the outcome of the score, the summative assessment, the summative test results, but instead what the teacher does with that data to meet students, and that's individual and group, instructional needs. And the why there is, unfortunately, while data has served a purpose, and we can dive in deeper on which data is most purposeful and which is not, it has thus far been an isolated piece of information, and it's not translated into standards-based growth in instruction. Instead, it has triggered what some people call the skill, drill, and kill, just to raise the test scores, not necessarily the knowledge. So we're going to use data in a very different way. Data is a tool instead of the end label or 50% of the end label. And in the last row, OTES 1.0, and you've experienced this, has that PGP, the two formal observations and walkthroughs, and 50% coming from student growth measures. In the growth model, we're going to keep the PGP. It's going to have a different purpose. You're going to have the two formal observations, but they will have different purposes. There's a post-holistic conference and focus areas when applicable. Walkthroughs remain, and high-quality student data is used. It's important to note this is not just they renamed student growth measures. That is not accurate. Student growth measures are removed from the law along with any percentage. And instead, we're looking to identify and use high-quality student data, which has different characteristics. And lastly, the progress on the PGP, whereas before it's been, I've completed, I've turned it in, therefore it's done. There is now an expectation that the PGP becomes a tool to ensure professional growth and professional learning is occurring. And overall, the why for that is those shifts in observational components, they create an expectation that the teacher is leading or collaborating with the evaluator for growth. It's no longer the evaluator comes in twice a year, you put on a performance, quote unquote, but instead there's a collaborative conversation. The evaluator is serving as an instructional leader, an instructional coach. And as I mentioned, the PGP is now a much more meaningful tool versus potentially a compliance form. Those are the big shifts that you will notice, or that is the purpose of the changes from 1.0 to 2.0. Let's get right down into the requirements, which are most likely the things that you are going to experience this coming year. I'm going to be referring to this document, the State Board of Education Framework. I don't expect you to be able to read it on the slideshow, but I want you to see what it looks like. It is one of those documents that was dropped into the chat box, and you can access to use that as a future reference. It embodies what the law requires and where State Board of Education has had authority to add to, or if you will, interpret what the law requires. So everything in the State Board of Education framework, everything I'm going to share with you today, is a gotta or a mandatory. Again, not expecting you to be able to read this, but pulling out that first paragraph, I'd like you to take the opportunity to look at that and see that right away the State Board of Education makes clear this is not just, oh, we're calling it 2.0, but it's 1.0 really. No, it makes clear that there has been a shift in the purpose and the content and the model of 2.0. It is a growth model as opposed to a performance model, and that's in the very first paragraph. It considers a teacher's instructional strengths. And that's not just a good, well, I'm going to tell you what you do well on because that makes you feel good. Instead, it's specifically using evidence aligned to the standards to reinforce what you as a teacher do very well, efficaciously for the students. And at the same time, identify areas for support. Support is not a synonym for it's a deficit area, it's deficiency, it's an improvement. It could be an area that you're already well on your way of being very strong in, but you're going to refine it, going to deepen your understanding, etc. The framework embeds multiple factors. So previously, where student growth measures were separate, the framework, it puts the use of data right in the expectations of the framework. It's no longer a separate quote unquote 50%. And it reiterates 2.0 is aligned to the standards. And this is something that across Ohio, we've unfortunately not been able to get a better connection to the standards, which are the true strength of OTES versus the rubric. And holistic ratings determined by evidence through informal observations. This is kind of a reiteration. It's always been to be about evidence through informal observations, and it's holistic. So we're looking for patterns, and it's not, well, you have 9 areas that are accomplished, but you have this one area that's a little bit weak. Therefore, I can't, quote unquote, give you X rating. I'd like also to call out that within that those first 2 paragraphs, and here underlined with red, the documents it refers to, it does refer to the framework, which we are going through right now. It also refers to the standards for the teaching profession, which are the anchor and where best practice truly does lie. Final holistic rating we discussed, and that combination of informal and formal observations and evidence. Some of you may remember seeing this front page. This is a summary page of the standards for Ohio educators. This is a 38-page document. It is the root, it is the anchor, it is what research and evidence have clearly stated are what you see in an effective teacher. It does not articulate the exact behavior the teacher calls the student by name per se, but instead these are standards that may be evidence and will look very different based upon the grade level and the topic and even the style of the teacher. These are the things that we should be aspiring for within our evaluation and also looking to for the purpose of professional growth. Again, this document has been put in the chat box, and so you have the opportunity to go in and to read it and to look at it. I like the summary page because it covers all 7 standards. I'd also like to point out that the Teacher Performance Rubric 2.0 has had substantial changes and revisions. You will notice, and here circled with red, in the second column, each organizational area and domain. So here we're talking about instructional planning. We would probably be looking at this when we're doing a pre-conference or possibly a post-conference conversation. And in each organizational area and domain, the rubric now leads both the evaluator and the educator to the how and the where you will be using high quality student data, HQSD. So for example, in a conversation with my evaluator, when I'm talking about how I have made instructional planning, how I've chosen resources, the activities, the pacing, any type of intervention, any structure as far as scaffolding information. When I talk about how the data helped me make those decisions, that's how I'm using element 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, and 3.3. And elements are really easy, although right now you're thinking, wait a minute, you've got a new term here. Let's go back to this for a second. The 1 right here would stand for the 1, and then 0.1 is just the first bullet. So when in the teacher performance rubric for 2.0, it says that I should be paying attention to element 1.1 when discussing and using high quality student data to inform my instructional planning, it's talking about this first bullet, that I am displaying knowledge of how my students learn and of the developmental characteristics of age groups. So this is where my data is talking about why I scaffolded, why I broke the tasks down into maybe developmental ages and levels, because I understand this group of students have that skill, this student does not have that skill based on data. The law requires a full evaluation every year. However, the law also permits the district to use a less frequent evaluation cycle for those who evidence a rating of skilled or accomplished. We're going to talk about the full evaluation cycle right now, even though some of you will start 2.0 in the less frequent evaluation cycle. But in this way, you know the full evaluation cycle, what to expect. We'll be focusing on the avocado 1970s green rectangle there. Let's skip that for a second. So the full evaluation cycle must include the minimum components specified above. These 5 bullets are the minimum required by law, and these would occur within the time frame of a single school year. A full evaluation is always mandatory for anyone with a final rating of ineffective or developing. A full evaluation cycle will start with a PGP. It's an annual plan where the teacher uses the evidence from the most recent evaluation cycle to identify their strengths and also their areas for growth. So this is really self-driven, which is an accomplished teacher. When you're skilled, you would do it collaboratively with your evaluator and developing much more relying upon input from your evaluator. And of course, ineffective, you are going to have an improvement plan. These goals are the what that the teacher, with the support from the district and evaluation, intend to grow professionally. This is that 1 year. Last year, I rocked at differentiation. This is the evidence in my cycle that shows that, but I want to go a little deeper with that. That could be a goal. Or last year, I struggled with classroom management based upon the type of students, or I'm anticipating this year, due to the long gap due to COVID, that classroom environment is going to be an area that I want to put a goal down for. The first observation you'll have, the 30 minutes or more, it is formal. It is now called holistic. It should be what's automatically or already occurring in your evaluation cycle. It is when the evaluator listens, watches, and records evidence of the standards that are occurring in that classroom instruction. There is never an expectation that every single standard occur in every instructional setting. Why is that? Because if we're planning for our evaluator to make sure that they see every single standard, then we are performing instead of planning for the student's needs, which will dictate which standards need to occur in the lesson being observed, because it's about the student's needs instructionally. And we also know that there are some standards which are not readily observable, and they have to be addressed or discussed in professional conversations, which would be the pre and the post conferences. Right after that first formal observation, which we're now calling holistic, there is a mandatory conference. Some districts have not or did not bargain pre and post conferences. So you may hear some people saying, this is my first conference ever. But for those of you who may have bargained and or agreed to pre and post conferences, this may be something that you're already doing, but has a slightly different purpose. This is when the evaluator and the teacher have that professional conversation to talk about what they saw in the observation, what standards were present, and what level of performance those standards were occurring at. And it could include, when applicable, the identification of focus areas. Now, focus areas are not your growth goals in your PGP, and they are not a synonym for improvement, weakness, deficiency. But instead, there are areas where both parties have collaborated and said, based upon what we have seen just right now in the formal observation, let's look at a couple of these areas. And when I come back the next time, the evaluator and or with walkthroughs, I'm really going to be providing you with formative feedback, resources, support. So if I do identify, wow, I have a handful of students this year, and with COVID, they are truly out of the practice of being at school. I'm going to anticipate, and maybe even their levels are all over the place based upon COVID as well. I'm really going to have to focus on classroom management and differentiation. You could make those your focus areas. And when my evaluator comes through by walkthroughs and or the next formal observation, they're going to be looking to give me feedback on those two areas. They do not have to be the same as the PGPs, because the PGP is the teacher's self-reflection with some collaboration from the evaluator. And the focus areas are based upon the immediate what we saw in the first formal observation. So there's two different levels and two different purposes. Through the full evaluation cycle, you're going to have walkthroughs, also known as informal observations. And those are just short formative observations by the evaluator to gather more evidence aligned to the standards and potentially provide feedback on those identified focus areas when applicable. The law says more than one classroom walkthrough within a full evaluation cycle. The number is based upon the local level. Usually the district and the union bargain those numbers. The next piece sequentially in a full evaluation cycle will be the formal focused observation and the emphasis on any focus areas. This is where the evaluator comes back and is looking to provide formative feedback to the teacher on the focus areas. And that feedback could be a conversation. What did you try with differentiation? You told me you tried these 3 new strategies. Did they work? No, they didn't. Okay, where are you going next with this? What did the data show when you tried those 3 new intervention strategies for differentiation? Here are some resources, or maybe you want to go down the hall and watch so-and-so because they are trying a new strategy, which I think might also apply to what you're trying to do here. It's that collaborative conversation where the evaluator is serving as the instructional leader. The final summative conference. This is the evaluator and teacher, again, meet to discuss the evaluation cycle evidence as aligned to the standards. And then it's represented in the rubric. So when I'm looking at a rubric and talking to a teacher or vice versa, it not only tells me, quote unquote, how my rating was derived, but it also shows the patterns in the evidence collected, that overall throughout the year, I have either grown possibly in differentiation and or maybe refined my practice in classroom management. and possibly continue to have solid evidence that supports I'm skilled or accomplished in some other area. Please note, there's a requirement for districts to provide a report to each teacher evaluated. That stays in the law. And a lot of times in practice, districts have put this conference and giving that report together. And that's fine, you can do that. But please do note that the report and the final conference are two separate requirements. Therefore, giving someone their OTES form or saying, go in, check it out, see what you think, and then, pin off if you feel comfortable with it, that doesn't meet the new requirements of this final summative conference. We're going to now shift to the less frequent evaluation cycle. It is the baby blue, smaller rectangle on the right-hand side from the State Board of Education framework. If the district has made the local decision to complete a less frequent cycle because a teacher has evidenced a final rating of accomplished or skilled, all the components above would occur within each school year of the cycle. So every single year in what some people term the off year, or I'm not being fully evaluated this year, or I'm not being evaluated this year, we're looking to refine that language for consistency, and State Board has defined this as less frequent cycle. So in each of those years, because you were previously accomplished or skilled, you will have a professional growth plan. You will have one observation and one conference with a discussion of the progress of the PGP. We break this down, and remember, a less frequent evaluation cycle can only be applicable to, and it is a local decision, those evidencing an accomplished or skilled from the most recent full evaluation cycle. So you're going to have a PGP, and I emphasize annual because in practice across the state, some people were not updating their PGP annually. You must have a new PGP every year, and it must be based upon the results of the most recent evaluation cycle. So even when let's say you were accomplished 2 years ago, and last year you had only one observation and one conference, it is still the expectation that this year you update your PGP based upon the observation that occurred last year and the conversation, etc. It is not a document you retool each year. It is a brand new document. One observation, formal or informal, a walkthrough, and that is a local decision. And one conference with a discussion including progress on the PGP. While there has always been a requirement to have one conference in those quote unquote off years or less frequent years, now that discussion must also include this idea of progress in the PGP. The conversation should include the evaluator determining if the teacher is making progress on their annual PGP. So in those quote unquote off years, the less frequent cycles, the expectation is that the PGP still serves as a tool and that you have identified goals for growth and that you are moving towards those goals. Progress is not synonymous with completion. It could be completed, or it might be something that's a bigger chunk of learning that takes all year to complete. And therefore, when you have your conference with your evaluator, you're progressing towards it, but maybe it's just not quite complete. So progress is the minimum required by the law. Excuse me. We have, again, I'm referencing the State Board of Education framework. And again, I don't expect you to be able to read this, but when you go back to look at it and go, oh yeah, that's what that document looked like that they were discussing. We're going to move into high quality student data. I noticed that there's a question. Okay, no worries. It's okay. And we just double check to see if there's any questions. Looking good so far. There's no silly question, unless you say that to 8th graders and they spend the entire year trying to tell you which question will drive you up the wall. So moving to high quality student data, I think one of the best parts of the State Board of Education framework is this call out here. We're gathering evidence based on the standards that speak to student learning attributable to the teacher. So whatever we choose as high quality student data, it's about that data provides evidence of the student's learning that is associated with the teacher. Not only does this make clear that student learning objectives and shared attribution are now illegal, taken out of the law, it makes clear that we're looking for student learning. And therefore, we're going to have to dive deeper into the idea of achievement and growth as it relates to the understanding of what learning is. So we're not always looking for high quality student data, HQSD, that shows the kids came in as rock stars, because that's not evidence that there has been learning or growth. And it's not truly attributable to the teacher if they came in at high rates. However, if we have a source of high quality student data that does show us the true nature, that 5 kids came in very high, but 5 kids came in very low, but later when we looked at them, they both had advanced, achieved higher, grown. That would be an example of evidence that the students have learned, and that learning can be attributable to that teacher. To be clear, 1.0 used data as a separate standalone percentage. 2.0 does not. Student growth measures are removed from law. No more math with respect to math teachers. If you're looking at the document, I'm going to jump down to the second set of rectangular bullets before I go over the requirements of high quality student data. The State Board of Education framework makes clear the expectations of what a teacher is supposed to do with the data from high quality student data. And these are the 4 overarching expectations for teachers: critically reflecting and analyzing the data, but then you use that information in an ongoing manner for student learning. Considering student learning needs and styles, and that can also include strengths and weaknesses of an entire class as well as individuals. Informing instruction and adapting instruction, and this is the really heavy lift for teachers, what they do day in and day out to meet those students' needs based upon the information from your data analysis. So what the data tells you, now how are you going to use that to meet the needs of the students? And measuring student learning, you're probably thinking, wow, we measure student learning all over the time. True, and it will include achievement and or growth. But this can also include the formative, that we're constantly, or how can we say it, purposely checking with formative checks the progress that students are making towards the content standards from the state at the state and local level. Overall, these 4 expectations actually align with the expectations that have been in the standards 1, 3, 4, and 7 for over 2 decades. They are captured in the rubric. Essentially, it is no longer solely about the end performance or summative scores of students. That's important, but it's not the powerful part. Instead, it's how the teacher analyzes, makes those instructional decisions, monitors students' progress, and grows professionally to meet those students' needs. Many of you may realize that and say, wow, that's what a data cycle is. Exactly. How we use data to inform our instruction and make our decisions for the benefit of student needs. Going back to that document, that summary 1 page of the standards, here we have those 4 standards that have been there for over 2 decades. But often we have focused so heavily on the rubric understandably, because that's what our evaluator is looking for. But here again are the roots. This is the bedrock of what research says. When a teacher evidences these on a fairly consistent rate in their teaching, they are known and they're associated with by data with effective, efficient teaching. So standard one, understanding our students, their learning, the development, and the diversity of our students. Standard number three, understanding and using varied assessments to inform our instruction. So not just those end test scores that we've had for 50%, but those formative touch-based feedback points that then tell us in the middle of our instructional planning, what's going on with the students? What do they know next? Who has already learned? And who do I need to go back in and maybe intervene? 4, and again, this is a very meaty section for teachers. It's that when you're planning, when you're actually doing the instruction, making the decisions for resources, pacing, how you break down a standard into skills and comprehension, how you are using data to make all of those decisions to plan and deliver effective instruction. And you'll notice this says for each individual student, that embraces or encompasses the idea of differentiation. And lastly, and I call this 7-ish, because professionalism as a standard, there's a couple different pieces in it that are very unique. But the idea that what we learn about our students and our teaching and our methods and our resources, we then reach out and we learn more on our own or driven on our own that, oh, wow, I don't have a tool to meet that student's need. I need to go out and I need to learn more about what this child needs or the content, if the content has shifted. Or, wow, I've never had this type of classroom management consideration. What am I going to go out and learn professionally to meet those students' needs? Pardon me. The nuts and bolts of the law as to the requirements state that each teacher must have a minimum of 2 measures of HQSD. This does not mean a pre and a post, but 2 sources, if you will, 2 kinds, 2 flavors. Each teacher must have at least 2. You can have more than that. And you can also bring in data that you find important and actionable from your grade level and topic, but you must meet this minimum of 2 HQSD. The law mandates that value added, if you have it, is going to automatically be one of those. So if you are 3 through 8 or 4, well, not 4, 5 and 7 science, 3 through 8 math and ELA, and the end of course exams at the high school level, you already have one of your HQSDs decided for you. You already have that in hand because you're going to have to use it. But remember, use it has changed dramatically. It is not, well, here's the N rating. You were green, you were red, or your SLO was 3. It is now what you do with it. So this finally allows people to use value added in the way it was meant to be used when first introduced almost 40 years ago. And it's already considered HQSD. So in some ways it's like, okay, I've got 1 off my plate, I know that. And it must be used when attributable to the teacher being evaluated. So if you're 8th grade ELA, you can't say, no, thank you. I don't find any value in that value added. But instead it will be something that you have to look at and analyze. But the great thing again is that finally, when your analysis shows long-term historic trends, and yes, it does not immediately inform the group of students in front of you as to which standard needs to be addressed, you can finally acknowledge that historic, the data trends, either with you on that grade level and topic or with that group of students, you can honestly use value added the way it was meant to be not this expectation that somehow it tells you what you're going to do with the students tomorrow in the classroom. Vendors from the ODE approved list, the assessment list, they are a may. Previously, they were mandated. Now they go to may. If your district has an existing approved assessment on that list, they will, and in many places we have bargained that teachers will be part of that decision, have to look at that list and say, okay, we have the MAP, or we use the Terra Nova, or we use Dibbles. To which grade level and topic does that vendor assessment meet the requirements specified in the framework? And we'll talk about those in a second. Basically, not every single assessment on the list can be used for every single teacher in the district. HQSD can also be determined at the local level. There will be plenty of areas where there's not a value added, there's currently not a vendor assessment, or quite frankly, a district can't afford to buy another vendor, where you will have places where there is no formal HQSD, and it's going to have to be determined at the local level. Again, this is going to have to meet the State Board of Education requirements. I'll go through that in a second. These could include grade level or topic level group assessments. It could include possibly free resources. The Achieve the Core has some wonderful assessments that can be used for this purpose. It could be a national nonprofit, the Library of Congress, many historical societies have social studies assessments and units, which, because the United States mainly share the Common Core now, meet multiple states' standards. So you can be looking for free places there. There's also the ability to work within a district to assemble a team to create an HQSD, maybe for a grade level that has nothing. There will be people who are isolated. So maybe you're the only AP chemistry teacher. And it may be that you reach out to all the other AP chemistry teachers across the state. We know that ESCs are working to meet this need. We also know the department is working to meet this need. Additionally, professional groups such as the Ohio Music Educators Association, they are looking at some of the tools they had previously that were SLOs to see if they could be retooled, the assessment part, to meet the needs of the high quality student data. So if you are somebody going, I don't have a vendor, I don't have a value added, the good news is you are in the same boat with everyone else who teaches your grade level and topic across the state. That means the need will create the ability and the opportunity for people to find, identify, locate, and where appropriate, create. The other good news for this year, 2021 to 2022, school year only, COVID legislation, Ms. 404, prohibits the use of high quality student data for OTES 2.0 this year. This was from legislators as part of the COVID flexibilities. And this is wonderful because it allows everyone transitioning into 2.0 this year, coming off of 2 very bumpy years with COVID, to have yet another year to really nail down quality sources of HQSD. This will allow the local and the district to get together to find out what are the needs, who already has 2 pieces, who only has 1 piece, what's out there, looking at vendors, looking at ESC, deciding what teams by either topic or grade level might need to maybe take out a common assessment from a couple years ago, reboot that, make sure it aligns to the new content standards, make sure it aligns to State Board of Education expectations, and use that for HQSD. So this gives us a little more time to address this need. So I've been talking about what requirements that has to happen for HQSD. So here is what State Board of Education says. I give great kudos to the State Board and legislators that instead of providing a list, which may or may not fit the over 800 districts in Ohio and all the grade levels and topics within those districts, instead they said, whatever you choose. Now we know value added is a mandatory. We know vendors, that can be a source for us to make decisions. But if it is a locally determined measure, here is what it has to hit. These are the bells, if you will. It has to align to learning standards. So it can't be about social and emotional learning. It can't be about adaptive skills, which while appropriate, they don't meet the requirements in the law because this is about data from learning standards. The content learning standards might be the state adopted. They might be locally district adopted. And in some places where there are no state standards, it might be the national standards. So there's different levels that you might look at when you're looking for potential areas for HQSD. It has to measure what it is intended to measure. This is not a watered down way to say validity and reliability, although that certainly should be considered. Instead, it's about making sure that the assessment we choose, the source, the measure, is really measuring the content standards and the students. So for example, there was a great 5th grade science informational text assessment a few years back. And it was often used by science teachers in 5th grade, and it was great. However, when you looked into it and you broke it down, because it really focused, most of it focused on informational text and pulling out primary, secondary resources and being able to use the different keying systems within informational text, such as, subtitles, etc. The test actually, or the assessment actually assessed reading skills much more than it did science. So you have to look at the assessment, even one that you've used for a long time, and say, is this truly showing me what the students can or cannot do on the standards? Or is there another skill or another level of understanding that this test is really actually measuring, even though it speaks to the standards I'm looking at? Any source must be attributable to a specific teacher for course and grade levels taught. The ACT is on the approved vendor list. No one will argue regarding its validity and credibility. But if I were to assign that as an HQSD for a kindergarten teacher, it would not be meeting this expectation. We want to ensure that every single teacher has actionable, meaty sources of HQSD so that it tells them great things about their students with that content that they're teaching, from which they can make instructional decisions. Demonstrate evidence of student learning. Please note that the State Board amplified this to include achievement and/or growth. So when you're looking at an assessment, you're going to have to step back a little bit and say, okay, is this showing how far the child can go, what they already brought to the classroom, or what is not even on my standards, which may be appropriate? Or is this focused to more of a growth mindset in that on this specific standard, I can show, or it shows me, where the student has come from and where the student has gone or still needs to go. So your HQSD measures and resources, you may want to, where possible, look for a good balance of achievement and/or growth. Follow protocols for administration and scoring. This received, not within evaluation, but during the budget bill, which now has been passed for 2021, there was emphasis put on several areas within the Code of Conduct. The ethical use of assessments is a document which all teachers should be aware of. It basically makes clear when administering any type of assessment that has high stakes consequences, which would certainly include evaluation, there are specific activities that you may not do in order to purely raise the test score. Now, you shouldn't be wanting to just raise this test score now in 2.0 because that will actually work against you. But it's very important that whatever's chosen at HQSD be treated with the same kid gloves, if you will, and use those specific protocols. And you'll want to check that ethical use of assessments document. Provide trustworthy results. There should never be an individual in a room creating their own HQSD measure with no one else watching, no one else reviewing it, and then turning it in and saying, wow, look, my kids went from 0 to hero, and that's all me. Not offend or be driven by bias. As common sense as this may seem, caveat emptor, there was a central Ohio district of a good name that purchased a vendor during COVID for online instruction. And the vendor, a good name, not something off-brand. And parents called because some of the social studies content was so offensive and biased. So you do need to make that effort to go through and consider that context of, is there bias for any cultural, ethnicity, linguistic, socioeconomic group within this assessment? So that full evaluation starts with that PGP. And again, this is probably something that you will deal with first, although when we think of evaluation, the PGP is not necessarily what we think is most important. When you or anyone else as an educator writes a complete your PGP or improvement plan, there is a legislative requirement that it align to any existing building or district ESEA or ESSA plans. Basically what that means, if your building or district has an improvement plan because of possibly low literacy scores for the third grade guarantee, or there's a subgroup that consistently is not making the achievement gap, or possibly there is through IDEA, there's been an issue with special education services specific to how they're performing. You as an individual teacher, irregardless of your rating or your cycle, you have to align your PGP or your improvement plan to that effort. It does not mean that you have to make your whole PGP about the building's third grade reading score. It is limited to those federal triggers, ESEA or ESSA, building plans based upon Department of Education or the Federal Department of Education. It must be aligned. Moving in the same direction, it does not mean your plan has to show exactly how you're going to solve the problem, but instead you have to do a nuance or an alignment to any plan that's in existence. And consider some cross-curricular efforts. So for example, if I was a 5th grade science teacher and I'm writing my PGP in a building, which our K-3 literacy component is not good, hasn't been good for several years, and therefore we're on a plan from the Department of Education for that component. I do not have to make my PGP all about how I'm going to fix the 3rd grade scores, but instead I do need to address or acknowledge that whatever I'm doing in my PGP, I'm moving in the same direction, or I'm aware of what my building or my district is having to do, and I'm putting my efforts in how I can. Now, if I'm a science teacher, I'm not teaching the 3rd grade students, and possibly I'm not a reading teacher. So you could put within your PGP that you're committing to doing more nonfiction, informational text within your units. So you're going to give them more to read. You're going to call out informational text components to help them read informational text better. So that might be something very lightweight that you can, again, just cross-curricular, moving in the same direction to align to that expectation in the law. If you were a second grade teacher, obviously that would not fulfill the expectation. And in your PGP, you would certainly have to have a goal that does discuss in a stronger manner addressing the building or district triggered plan. So that is, let's see, 52 minutes of OTES 2.0. There are many, many questions. And the wonderful thing is you have the documents that were downloaded. Print those out, refer to those. Those are the framework is the shall and the, if you will, the gotta. So it can always provide you the minimum that you will have to do. And the standards and the rubric can give you a vision of what the expectation is for HQSD now. Additionally, it's my understanding that you were given, or a document was made available to you on the hub last Friday, August 13th, that will share more of the local decisions that you, your association, the district, an OTES committee have made. So that may be the next source that you want to go to look for specific answers to specific questions. So I've stopped the screen share, and this is the opportunity to ask questions. We have about maybe 5 minutes left. There is no silly question. If you need something reinforced or refined, please put that in the chat group.
Ellen,
and we will go ahead.
No, I don't see any questions right now. You did a fantastic job. One thing that Jen, our union president, sent me like a feedback Google form. So I'm going to drop that in the chat. It's super quick. There's like 4 questions. And in that Google form, if people have a question, maybe later on today, they think about it, or tomorrow, they can add that into that Google form, and then we will communicate with you about that. So I'm going to drop that in right now. There we go.
And I only started stuttering on my words once I heard that webinar is now being recorded.
Oh, sorry. I should have warned you.
No, it was fine. It was like, oh, I just stumbled on my words. But there was a question. I noticed that there was, I hope that got resolved.
Yeah, so there's a question about examples of the, oh shoot, where is it? Of the HQSD. And then she did respond back that did get answered, but maybe if you had any other examples of the HQSD.
So when you're going about selecting, of course, we know value added is a gotta. And it's my experience that across the state, a lot of people were, quote unquote, given value added without the benefits of having a training that showed how value added could be used and analyzed. So you may have value added and truly feel like, I don't know how to use it, and you're not alone. So that's a need that I also think will be part of HQSD. The vendor assessments, if you look at the vendor assessment, there are things, and I will give credit to, again, to the department, they did a really great job. The assessments that are on the vendor assessment list now, they've asked each vendor to provide a little 1 page that states whether they think that their assessment would be applicable to all of the requirements for state board. So when you're going about the point of making decisions as to which vendor that you already use or that you might want to purchase, there's now a 1-page document from each of the vendors that kind of guides you to, oh, they already hit all of these bells that are required for HQSD. So there's a little bit less going through the weeds in that decision making. Lastly, the local. Again, every place there's no value added or vendor, that applies across the state. So when you have a fourth grade social studies group that gets together, either it be through the district or a PLC that they form on their own, or through the ESC, and they go and they say, okay, which standards are important? What type of data do we want to have on these students that will be instructionally actionable? That's where you will create what you need. And of course, all good educators know where to beg, borrow, or lift. So going to places and finding assessments that are online, caveat emptor, always making sure that they're quality. I mentioned Achieve the Core. They have K through 12 ELA and math formative assessments that are free. And I find them to be, and I hate this word, rigorous, but they are good quality. So that might be an easy place to go shopping first. You'll want to avoid things that, for example, that something that is perfunctory. If it doesn't give you the data you need to know, then it's not a good assessment for HQSD purposes. If I do a letter check in kindergarten, yes, that's important, that's valuable to me, but that's only one standard that it hits. Maybe that's important the first quarter, which it is. So maybe that's a good HQSD for the first quarter. The other thing is you can be flexible with this HQSD. It is not as though if you have something that works toward the beginning of the year, but you need something different at the other end of the year, you could at the local level approve both. I do suggest that the district and association, when you're looking at an OTES committee or any type of HQSD committee, that you develop a process that allows individual teachers to bring forward things they've found so that the committee can look at it then. It's not like doing an SLO, but if you have a ninth grade Spanish teacher who says, this is what's valuable for my content and grade level, and I got it from so-and-so, they could then forward that to that committee, and the committee can go, oh, yep, it hits everything, boom. Yes, we'll put that on the menu as you could use this for HQSD. Or they could also say, no, it didn't meet these three, and give that information back to the teacher. I think that will help everyone help build and find sources.
Thank you, Ellen. A couple of things I'll jump in. If you look on the hub and the link for the handbook, what Ellen mentioned, we actually have some examples on their curriculum department. And our OTES committee, which was TALS members and administrators, have worked on some of those processes. So take a peek. There are examples. The other thing you'll find in there are the building and district goals. So when you're writing your PGP, if you're not sure, they're in there as well. So you can click on that, in the hub and look at the handbook. That should help guide your PGP and maybe any questions you have.
That's fantastic. I really appreciate, because there's so many goals out there and so many initiatives and plans. It can be overwhelming in the classroom. It's great to know that they're in one place. It's so thankful. And the first year at the PGP, we all understand that based upon COVID, it's going to be like shooting darts in the dark a little bit. But once we finally have, knock on wood, a normal year, whatever normal means in education, Ohio, that PGP will be a little more fluid. So this year might be a little bumpy.
So again, please fill out the feedback form. That will help us, the OTES committee, know, is there something we need to better explain, something else you need, something that, is concerning. So if you can fill that out, it should be quick and easy. I know that link is in the presentation. That will help us. And Ellen, thank you for your time. If there's no other questions, I know everybody has a busy day, so we'll let everyone log off and get back to getting ready for the school year.
Thank you, everyone. Be safe.
Thank you.
I also emailed that form link to everyone also, because I have some people are watching it together, like as a group, which is cool. So I just emailed the form out to everyone.
Awesome. Thank you. Good idea.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.